boys and girls instead of innocent mice in his experiments with mephitic air? How much better than the bratty kids were the results of these experiments? Of scientific progress, Franklin commented, "It occasions my regretting sometimes that I was born so soon. It is impossible to imagine the height to which may be carried in 1,000 years the power of man over matter. We may perhaps learn to deprive large masses of their gravity and give them absolute levity for the sake of easy transport. Agriculture may diminish its labor and double its produce. All diseases may by sure means be prevented or cured." And here's the kicker, "not excepting even that of old age. And our lives lengthened at pleasure beyond the antediluvian standard." Later on, in letters to friends, Franklin trimmed his timetable by a full 900 years, when he said that a mere 100 years would see modern science produce discoveries of which we have no conception. And he said again that the art of physics, by which he meant medicine, would advance so far and so fast that humankind would be able to avoid diseases and be able to live as long as the patriarchs in Genesis, to which I suppose, he says, we should make little objection. In these comments, Franklin makes it clear that even the antediluvian standard is not insuperable. Franklin says that it's impossible to imagine the height to which scientific power will rise, and that height would therefore have to include what we could imagine. And we can certainly imagine the conquest of death, which he claims is nothing but another disease. Old age and dying are diseases, like the flu or the mumps. And we learn how to cure those. We'll learn eventually one day how to tackle the big one. But why should Franklin, or would he comment that he supposes we should make little objection to all this? Why any objection at all? The answer is that Franklin knew there was a fly in the ointment of Bacon's project for the conquest of nature and the relief of man's estate. As Franklin makes clear in his letters, from the scientific point of view, which he shared, aging and even death are curable diseases, to repeat a point. But he knew perfectly well, however, that from the biblical point of view, death is the wages of sin. And those who believe this about death might well object to Bacon's project and Franklin's approval of it, and see it as the proud and blasphemous attempt to play God. Franklin's wisecrack about kids and mice in mephitic air has a serious and even nasty edge that reminds us of the current debate about stem cell research and cloning. It makes a lot more sense to be worried about those matters if one believes that we human beings are sinful but still created in the image of God than it does if one believes that we human beings are on our own in this world. Franklin knew perfectly well that the progress he envisioned wouldn't always jibe completely with the faithful view of life. In 1751, Franklin published a piece in the Pennsylvania Gazette called "Appeal for the Hospital." In the autobiography, Franklin describes his maneuvers on behalf of the hospital project as his most charitable use of political cunning. The ruse consisted of what must be and what was the first matching grant in the history of America. Franklin convinced the Pennsylvania Assembly, including many of its members in no mood for the charitable spending, to pledge money toward the hospital on the condition that the sum would be matched by private contributors. That condition carried the day in the Assembly because the members opposed to the charity thought that private contributions would never turn up. So they could get the reputation for virtue without having to pay for it. Franklin then used the pledge from the Assembly to cajole the private donors into giving $1 when he said, without the Assembly's money, I would ask you for $2. So the conditional clause in the Assembly bill, he says, worked both ways. This story puts a really charming gloss on the scheme for the hospital, by which Franklin managed to turn selfish impulses to charitable ends. But the essay in the Gazette, in fact, contained a serious reflection on the relationships among charity, suffering, and disease. Franklin there argues that the remarkable thing about all living creatures is that all, regardless of kind or individual characteristics, are subject to disease. The ancient poets noted this fact when they said that Achilles was vulnerable in his heel. Of all the animals, however, Franklin continues, man is unique in being subject to the most diseases, whether they are effects of our intemperance and vice, or are given us that we may have a greater opportunity of exercising toward each other that virtue which most of all recommends us to the deity. I mean, and then he writes in big giant capitals, charity. Franklin follows up these three, this part of the essay with three references to the gospel according to Luke: the story of the Good Samaritan, the story of the rich man and Lazarus, and the story about Jesus and the 10 lepers. The lesson to be drawn, says Franklin, is that care of the sick, regardless of who they are, seems essential to the true spirit of Christianity. In particular, the story of the rich man and Lazarus shows that, quote, "I was sick and ye visited me," is one of the terms of admission into bliss, and the contrary, a cause of exclusion. Franklin here is, in his own inimitable way, very delicate, because the exclusion of which he's talking is condemnation to the agonizing fires of hell. But he immediately gets down to brass tacks when he says that our circumstances are subject to change according to providence, and that we should help each other and not harden our hearts against the lowly who are sick, lest we find ourselves one day in their places, and that we may suffer for hard-heartedness, and what we might suffer for hard-heartedness in this world pales before what we might suffer for hard-heartedness in the next. If we do want to be charitable to the sick, it's much better to do so by building a hospital that can help more people with greater skill. Even the pagans thought that nothing made men more like God than helping the sick. And if the pagans felt this way, how much more should we expect from Christians, for whom the inclination of duty is enhanced by the sanctions of revelation? So apart from the rhetoric of self-interest, rightly understood, that he uses in the essay, the hospital will help others, but also help those who give, Franklin clearly and most stirringly appeals to the idea that disease is the occasion for charity, for the practice of which we are rewarded with heaven, and for the neglect of which we're punished by the fires of hell. Now, it's one thing to tend to the sick, even with a hospital, and improve methods for alleviating suffering. Mother Teresa could not possibly disagree with that. But it's quite another thing to aim to put an end to the very occasion for charity, or its neglect for that matter. One might make the heterodox argument that working toward the technological conquest of disease and death is the highest charity. Bacon tried to get away with that argument. Franklin knew better than to try that on his neighbors. One might even add that those who, before the full conquest of death, devote themselves to science and don't themselves get the final goodie, will be resurrected by those who come afterwards and who will pop them out of their cryogenic tubes and hook them up and refresh them. I'm sure that if Franklin were alive today, he'd be in a cryogenic tube sitting right next to Ted Williams, except he'd make sure they didn't knock his head off, getting him into the tube. And one might even say that all this is in fact a working out of divine providence. Bacon tried to make that claim. Franklin, however, living among his fellow Calvinists and Presbyterian neighbors, didn't think that argument would sell to them one bit. For them, at least, taking salvation into one's own hands in any way is the essence of the sin of pride. Franklin had numerous quarrels with the Presbyterian establishment in the 1730s over good works and all of that stuff, and he intervened into religious politics quite a lot, and I'll get back to why he does, but he did, and he knew that this project, so described as I've just described, would be considered by all of his Presbyterian and Calvinist to be absolutely unspeakable hubris and unspeakable